It was a quiet evening in Melbourne, Australia, December 1977, when something truly horrifying shattered the peace of Collingwood's Easy Street. A neighborhood known for its working-class charm and close-knit families was about to become the scene of one of the most chilling, senseless, and unsolved crimes in Australian history. 3 young women full of life, dreams, and laughter were brutally murdered inside their own home, and to this day, no one knows who did it. This case isn't just about murder. It's about fear that gripped an entire city. It's about lost innocence, police failures, and the haunting possibility that a cold-blooded killer might have walked among them for decades, free. What really happened inside that small brick house on Easy Street? What did the killer want? And why were these women targeted? Tonight, we dive deep into a case that still sends shivers down the spine of everyone who dares to remember it. From the eerie silence of that night to the shocking discovery that followed, every moment will leave you questioning what you think you know about safety, trust, and justice. So grab your headphones, dim the lights, and prepare yourself, because this story is not for the faint-hearted. Welcome to the Easy Street Murders, a story of 3 lives cut short, and a mystery that refuses to die. It was Friday, December 9th, 1977. The weather in Melbourne was warm, and Christmas lights had just started to glow across the neighborhoods. Inside a modest brick house at 147 Easy Street lived 3 young women: Suzanne Armstrong, a 28-year-old teacher; her close friend, Susan Bartlett, 27, who worked as a clerk; and Suzanne's 16-month-old baby boy, Gregory. They were the kind of women who filled their small home with warmth, laughter, and the sound of life. But that night, something unimaginable entered through their door. Neighbors later said they heard nothing unusual: no screams, no breaking glass, no cries for help. Just the usual city hum, but behind those quiet walls, a horror was unfolding. Someone had entered their home, possibly someone they knew, or maybe a stranger who had been watching them for days. The attack was swift, brutal, and merciless. When police finally entered the house 2 days later, they were greeted by a scene so violent that seasoned detectives were left shaken. Both women had been stabbed repeatedly, dozens of times. The brutality was personal, intimate, filled with rage. Suzanne's little boy was found alive in his cot, dehydrated and crying. He had been left alone with his mother's body for nearly 2 days. It was a miracle he survived. But from that moment on, the peaceful street was never the same. When news of the murders broke, shock turned into terror. Newspapers screamed headlines about the Easy Street murders, and the public demanded answers. Who could do such a thing? Why them? Police began questioning everyone: friends, ex-boyfriends, neighbors, even strangers who had passed by the street that week. But every lead seemed to go nowhere. Detectives collected evidence: fingerprints, a bloody footprint, strands of hair. But forensic technology was primitive in the 1970s. They couldn't identify the killer. Witnesses claimed to have seen a man lurking near the house earlier that week, but his description was vague, almost ghost-like. The killer had vanished without a trace. In the following days, fear gripped Collingwood. Women began locking their doors earlier. Parents refused to let their daughters walk home alone. And on Easy Street itself, an eerie silence took over. Neighbors whispered that the killer might be one of them, a face they saw every morning, smiling, waving, pretending to be normal. Nobody knew whom to trust anymore. And as the sun set on that haunted neighborhood, police realized this wasn't just another murder. This was something far darker, a crime that carried the fingerprints of evil itself. What they didn't know then was that decades would pass, and still the truth would remain buried in the shadows of Easy Street. It was Sunday, December 11th, 1977, 2 full days after the horrific crime had taken place, when a close friend of Suzanne's decided to check in. Suzanne hadn't shown up for work on Friday, and her colleagues had begun to worry. It wasn't like her to miss school without a call. The phone rang endlessly in her house, unanswered. That's when her friend decided to drive to 147 Easy Street herself, thinking perhaps Suzanne was unwell or had taken the weekend off. As she approached the quiet little house, she noticed something unsettling. The curtains were drawn in the middle of the day. The mailbox was stuffed with letters. And the most chilling part, there was no sound coming from inside, not even the faint cry of baby Gregory. With trembling hands, she tried knocking. Then she opened the front door, and what she saw next would stay with her forever. The smell hit first, the unmistakable heavy scent of death. Her eyes widened as she stepped into the hallway. The once lively home was now frozen in chaos. Furniture was overturned, blood smeared across the walls, and in one of the bedrooms lay the lifeless bodies of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett. Both women had been savagely attacked, their final moments filled with unspeakable horror. The friend screamed and ran out, her voice breaking through the stillness of the street. Within minutes, police sirens filled the air. Detectives swarmed the scene, but the damage was already done. They found baby Gregory in his cot, alive but weak, a survivor of 2 nights alone among death. One officer later said he would never forget that moment. The tiny boy reaching out from his crib, eyes glassy and confused, surrounded by silence. That single detail broke even the hardest hearts on the force. The murders weren't just brutal, they were heartless. Police quickly sealed the area, combing for evidence. They collected fingerprints, analyzed footprints, even checked for signs of forced entry, but there were none. The killer hadn't broken in. He had walked in. Maybe the door was left unlocked, or maybe the women knew him. That one possibility would change the direction of the entire investigation. The detectives knew. Whoever had done this wasn't just a monster. He was someone close, someone who had earned their trust before shattering it completely. As word spread through Melbourne, fear turned into obsession. News outlets called it Australia's most gruesome double murder. Reporters gathered outside the street, broadcasting images of the small brick house that had become a nightmare. The public wanted justice, but police had nothing. No suspects, no motive, no murder weapon. Just 2 innocent women and a mystery that seemed to grow darker with every passing hour. And that's when whispers began to circulate. Whispers that the killer might still be nearby, watching. Some said they had seen a shadow lurking near the corner at night. Others claimed they heard footsteps echoing in the alley behind the house. Whether real or imagined, one thing was certain: Easy Street would never feel safe again. Detectives from the Victoria Police Homicide Squad immediately took charge of the case. The crime scene was unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was pure rage carved into reality. Yet there was something oddly deliberate about it, too. The killer had been careful. No valuables were missing. No signs of sexual assault were confirmed. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal, planned, and executed with chilling precision. Investigators began by mapping the victim's last known movements. On Thursday night, Suzanne and Susan had gone out for a casual evening with friends. They were seen laughing, carefree, unaware that it would be their last night alive. Around midnight, Suzanne was dropped off at home, carrying baby Gregory, who was fast asleep. A neighbor recalled hearing the sound of footsteps shortly after, slow, deliberate steps, but brushed it off as nothing. That single moment would later haunt her for years. Police interviews painted a picture of 2 kind, well-loved women. Suzanne was a teacher who cared deeply for her students, known for her patience and warmth. Susan was quiet but friendly, someone who always smiled at neighbors passing by. They weren't involved in anything dangerous, didn't owe anyone money, and had no known enemies. So who would hate them enough to commit such savage murders? That question became the driving force of the investigation. Detectives initially suspected a man who had briefly dated Suzanne, a casual acquaintance named Derek. He had a temper, according to some friends, and had been seen near the house days before the murders. But when questioned, he had an airtight alibi. Another possible suspect was a local drifter who had been spotted in the area, but no evidence tied him to the scene. For every name the police investigated, a dead end followed. Every clue seemed to vanish the moment they reached for it. Then came the forensic tests, blood samples, fingerprints, hair analysis, all done with the limited technology of the 1970s. The results were vague, frustratingly inconclusive. No DNA testing existed then, and most evidence couldn't point to anyone specific. Investigators were left staring at photos, studying patterns, rereading reports over and over again as the case began to grow cold. One detective described it as chasing a ghost through fog. But even as leads dried up, one detail continued to haunt them. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever did this had been let inside. The women had either trusted him or been too shocked to react when he appeared at their door. That single fact convinced detectives they were dealing with someone the victims knew. Someone who had smiled in their presence, and later took their lives without mercy. The investigation stretched into weeks, then months. Officers followed every tip, every rumor. But as time passed, the horror began to fade from headlines. People moved on. Easy Street tried to return to normal. But behind closed doors, residents still double-locked their doors, checked their windows twice, and never forgot the smell of death that had once filled their quiet lane. What nobody realized then was that the case was already slipping away, piece by piece, clue by clue, and that the killer had blended back into society, unrecognizable, untouchable, and free. The murders on Easy Street didn't just destroy two innocent lives. They sent a wave of terror through Melbourne that lingered for years. It was the kind of fear that made every woman glance over her shoulder, every mother check the locks twice before bed. People who had once laughed about living in Collingwood now whispered in dread. The police patrols increased, the streets went quieter, and every unfamiliar face looked like a potential killer. Newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. Front pages screamed Easy Street horror, and journalists painted vivid pictures of the brutal crime. Some articles even speculated that a serial killer was on the loose. The details, the ferocity of the attack, the innocence of the victims, the surviving baby, made it one of the most haunting stories in Australian history. It wasn't just a murder anymore. It was an open wound in the heart of a community. Neighbors described how, after the murders, people stopped trusting each other. The friendly small-town feeling that once defined the area was gone. Friends became suspicious. Conversations grew shorter, and every knock on the door sent hearts racing. One woman later told reporters, "After that night, I couldn't sleep. I'd hear footsteps outside and freeze, thinking the killer had come for me next." That was the effect of the Easy Street murders. Fear that crawled under your skin and stayed there. Meanwhile, police worked desperately to regain control of the narrative. Detectives held press conferences, promising the public that the investigation was progressing. But behind the scenes, they were frustrated and divided. The crime scene had been contaminated. Too many officers, too many reporters, too much chaos. Evidence had been handled poorly, and key items were either misplaced or never properly tested. The case was crumbling from the inside, and no one wanted to admit it. Amidst the fear and confusion, new rumors began to swirl. Some claimed a jealous lover had snapped in rage. Others whispered about a mysterious intruder seen lurking near the train tracks behind Easy Street. One particularly strange theory suggested a local butcher might have been involved because of the precision of the wounds. Clean, practiced cuts. But every lead turned to dust. The killer seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only speculation and sleepless nights. And as days turned into weeks, the police slowly realized something devastating. The trail was already cold. They had no fingerprints that matched anyone in their system, no witnesses willing to testify, no clear motive. The city that had once demanded justice began to accept silence. The murders became an urban legend, a dark story parents told their kids as a warning. Lock your doors. Remember what happened on Easy Street, but what nobody knew was that the real story, the truth of who did it, might have been hidden in plain sight all along. Months after the brutal killings, as the public's panic began to fade into grim acceptance, detectives returned to the house on Easy Street one more time. They needed to re-examine everything, every photograph, every mark, every drop of blood. Sometimes answers hide in plain sight, waiting for fresh eyes to notice what others missed. The air inside the house still carried that cold heaviness, as if the memory of violence refused to leave. One officer, newly assigned to the case, noticed something odd in the crime scene photos. In the corner of Suzanne's bedroom wall, faint but visible, there was a partial handprint. It had been catalogued months earlier but never matched to anyone. The officer requested to have it reanalyzed. The prints were compared again, carefully, but once more, no match. It was as if the killer had never existed in any database. That discovery brought both frustration and renewed curiosity. Who was this phantom who had slipped in and out of their world, leaving behind only fear and a single partial print? Then there was another detail, the way the victims were attacked. Both women had been stabbed repeatedly, but not in a random frenzy. The wounds suggested the killer had some control, a kind of cold precision. This hinted that he wasn't acting purely out of rage. He knew exactly what he was doing. Perhaps it was revenge. Perhaps it was power. Detectives began to build a psychological profile. A man in his late 20s to early 40s, likely local, possibly someone who knew the victims personally or lived nearby. A predator who blended perfectly into everyday life. As forensic evidence failed, investigators turned to witnesses again. A neighbor, hesitant at first, recalled hearing footsteps outside around midnight that Thursday. Heavy, deliberate steps on the gravel path. She also thought she heard a faint baby cry afterward, followed by silence. Another local mentioned seeing a man walking away from the area early Friday morning, his shirt slightly stained and his pace quick. The police followed up, but the man was never identified. The description was too vague. Tall, dark hair, wearing a jacket. He could have been anyone. Despite these fragments of evidence, the puzzle refused to come together. The case files thickened, pages filled with speculation and disappointment. Some detectives believed the killer was a friend or ex-lover of Suzanne. Others thought it was a random act of violence, maybe by a passing stranger. But as each theory fell apart, one chilling truth became clear. Whoever had done this had planned it well enough to leave nothing solid behind. By the time the first anniversary arrived, flowers and cards appeared quietly outside 147 Easy Street. Strangers who never knew Suzanne or Susan came to pay their respects. The house stood silent, dark windows reflecting years of unanswered questions. And among those who came to mourn, there were whispers. Whispers that maybe the killer was standing there too, watching the crowd, remembering every moment of what he'd done. The clues were there. They always were. But in a sea of evidence and human error, the truth was slipping further away, hidden under the weight of time and fear. By early 1978, the investigation had stalled. Leads had dried up, and detectives were desperate for a breakthrough. That's when the focus shifted, not to the evidence, but to the people surrounding Suzanne and Susan. The police began digging into their personal lives, tracing every friend, co-worker, and acquaintance who had ever crossed paths with them. It was a slow, grueling process, and soon, the case took a darker, more complicated turn. The first major suspect was Suzanne's ex-boyfriend, a man named Ian. They had dated briefly before she gave birth to Gregory. He was known for his temper, but friends insisted he had moved on. Still, investigators brought him in for questioning. For hours, he sat under harsh lights as detectives fired questions at him. Where was he that night? Did he still have feelings for Suzanne? Why did neighbors say they'd seen him near Easy Street days before the murders? Ian denied everything. He claimed he had been at his parents' house all evening. His alibi checked out. No blood, no fingerprints, no motive that could stick. But the suspicion never fully left him. Then, attention shifted to a man named Derek Percy, a known violent offender already imprisoned for other crimes. His history of sadistic behavior made him a chilling fit for the profile. He had been in Melbourne around the time of the murders, and the brutality of the crime matched his patterns. Detectives met with him in prison, asking if he had ever been near Easy Street. Percy smiled, a calm, eerie smile, and said nothing. His silence was almost as terrifying as a confession. Investigators couldn't prove his involvement, but many would later say they believed he knew something. Another lead pointed toward a mysterious man who had been renting a house not far from 147 Easy Street. Locals described him as quiet but strange, someone who kept to himself and often wandered the streets late at night. Police found out he had suddenly moved away right after the murders. No forwarding address, no trace. But again, no physical evidence connected him to the crime. The more suspects they found, the deeper the mystery became. It felt like every direction led to a dead end, and every dead end led back to the same terrifying thought. The killer could be anyone. Within the force, frustration boiled into anger. Officers argued over theories, evidence went missing, and some even accused others of mishandling the case. Public pressure was mounting. Newspapers demanded answers, families demanded justice, and the city demanded safety. Yet all the police could offer were theories and shadows. The case was spiraling into one of Australia's greatest failures, a perfect storm of brutality and confusion. And then came a strange twist. A man phoned the police station one night claiming he knew who the killer was. He said the murderer had bragged about it, that he'd killed 2 women on Easy Street and got away with it. But before detectives could trace the call, the line went dead. They tried calling back, no answer. The phone booth the call came from was empty. It was as if the caller had vanished into thin air. Whether it was a cruel prank or a genuine cry for truth, no one ever found out. But for the detectives still clinging to hope, it was another painful reminder that the truth was so close, close enough to hear its echo, yet still out of reach. As the months turned into years, the once burning fire of the Easy Street investigation began to fade into a faint glow of memory. Detectives who had once sworn they'd never rest until they found the killer began retiring, transferring, or simply losing faith. Files that were once handled daily started collecting dust in storage rooms. And for the families of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett, each day without justice was another wound that refused to heal. The police had followed hundreds of leads, some credible, others pure fantasy. Psychics claimed to have visions of the murderer's face. Anonymous letters arrived at the station describing gruesome details that only the killer could know, but every time they turned out to be hoaxes. The public had grown weary. News outlets moved on to fresher tragedies. Yet in the quiet corners of Collingwood, the name Easy Street still made people shiver. It became more legend than memory, a whispered story told in low voices after dark. Inside the police department, frustration had turned to shame. The case that once drew national headlines had become a symbol of failure. A new generation of detectives occasionally revisited the old files, convinced they could see something their predecessors had missed. But technology was still limited. Without DNA testing, the physical evidence was little more than useless relics. Fingerprints, fibers, shoe prints, none could point to anyone specific. The killer had vanished so completely that some began to wonder if he was even still alive. By the mid-1980s, a cruel silence had fallen over the investigation. There were no press conferences anymore, no public appeals, no updates. It was as if the case had been quietly buried, like the truth itself had been sealed away. But not everyone was ready to let go. A few detectives kept revisiting the scene on their own, unable to stop thinking about the brutality, the unanswered questions, and that one haunting detail, baby Gregory, who had survived. What would he think growing up, knowing he was the only one left from that night of horror? Even without answers, the psychological shadow of the case hung heavy over Melbourne. People still locked their doors earlier, avoided walking alone at night, and gave strangers wary glances. Some claimed they could still hear the echo of that baby's cries when they passed the house, a reminder of the tragedy that had taken place there. The house itself, though sold years later, was avoided by many locals who believed it carried bad energy, cursed by what had happened inside. The police had no choice but to mark the file cold. But even as they did, one detective wrote in the margins of the report, "He's still out there, watching, waiting." And those words would prove prophetic, because, decades later, the case would resurface in a way no one expected. By the early 2000s, nearly 25 years had passed since that horrifying night on Easy Street. Time had moved on, but the ghosts of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett still haunted Melbourne. Their families had grown older. Baby Gregory had become a man, and the once bustling street had changed. New paint, new people, new stories. Yet under that layer of modernity, something sinister still pulsed. The killer had never been caught, but with time came progress. DNA technology, once a distant dream, was now revolutionizing forensic science. Cold cases across Australia were being reopened, and long-forgotten evidence was giving up its secrets. When detectives decided to re-examine the Easy Street files, hope flickered again, faint but alive. They gathered the old exhibits, clothing, swabs, hair samples, and even that mysterious partial fingerprint. For the first time in decades, science might succeed where human eyes had failed. The evidence was carefully sent for modern testing. Weeks passed, then months. The anticipation grew unbearable. And finally results began trickling in. Partial DNA fragments, faint traces of a male profile found at the crime scene. It wasn't complete enough to identify, but it proved one thing. The killer had left part of himself behind. The case that once felt frozen in time suddenly came roaring back to life. Detectives began cross-checking the partial DNA with national databases, hoping for a match. But again, nothing. The killer's DNA didn't match any known offender. He was still invisible. Despite the setback, the renewed investigation rekindled public interest. Documentaries, newspaper features, and online discussions began resurfacing the story. Old neighbors who had stayed silent for decades started talking again. One woman, now in her 70s, claimed she had seen a man standing across from the house the night before the murders. Staring, unmoving, cigarette glowing in the dark. She had told police back then, but her statement had been lost in paperwork. Now, hearing her recount it brought a chill back to the room. As the media reignited the case, people started sending tips again, names, rumors, theories. Some pointed to Derek Percy once more. Others claimed the killer was a now-deceased drifter who had bragged about the murders before dying. A few even speculated that it was a police officer who had covered his tracks. None of it could be proven, but each rumor made the mystery feel painfully alive again. The families of the victims held on to that small spark of hope, that maybe, finally, they'd know the truth. And yet, with every new clue came disappointment. The DNA was too degraded to lead anywhere. Witnesses were too old and memories too blurred by time. The case once again began to slip through their fingers. For baby Gregory, now a grown man, that meant the questions he'd carried all his life remained unanswered. Who killed his mother and her friend? Why had he been spared? And could the killer still be alive, living a quiet, ordinary life somewhere, watching the world forget what he had done? The new technology had given them glimpses of truth, but not enough to catch a ghost. And just as hope began to fade again, a single unexpected clue would soon surface, one that would drag the case back into the spotlight and make everyone wonder if the killer had never left Melbourne at all. It was 2017, 40 long years since the horror on Easy Street, when the case took a chilling and unexpected turn. A retired detective named Ron Iddles, known for solving some of Australia's most complex murders, decided to reopen the file personally. He had always been haunted by the case, the brutality, the unanswered questions, the baby left crying in his cot. It never sat right with him. Now, with modern tools and new eyes, he wanted to see if anything had been overlooked. Iddles pored through every report, every photograph, and every forgotten note written in faded ink. And that's when he found something strange. A reference in an old police file to a man who had been questioned early in the investigation, then dismissed without proper follow-up. His name was Barry Watts. He had lived just a few streets away from Easy Street at the time of the murders. Later, he had been convicted for other violent crimes, including the abduction and murder of a young girl. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. Detectives began digging into Watts's background. He had been 22 in 1977, fit the physical description, and had a known history of violence against women. Even more disturbing, his work schedule at the time of the murders placed him near Collingwood. When his DNA was quietly compared with the degraded sample from the scene, it was close. Not a full match, but eerily similar. Could this be the man who had slipped through police hands decades earlier? But just as the investigation seemed to heat up, new obstacles appeared. Watts was serving a life sentence in another state, and the old DNA evidence wasn't strong enough for court. Officials hesitated to reopen a case without certainty. Some within the force pushed for more testing, but others warned it could backfire, that it would stir up pain for the families without delivering closure. It became a moral tug-of-war, chase a ghost or let the past rest. Meanwhile, journalists caught wind of the new developments and reignited the story across Australia. The headlines read, "Easy Street Murders, could a killer already be in prison?" The families of Suzanne and Susan were both hopeful and terrified. They had waited decades for answers, but the idea that justice might never come, even now, was almost unbearable. Baby Gregory, now a middle-aged man, publicly spoke for the first time. His voice trembled as he said, "I don't remember that night, but I live with it every day." His words silenced everyone watching. Despite the renewed interest, the case never reached a conclusion. The DNA results remained inconclusive. Barry Watts denied everything. The authorities eventually shelved the investigation again, stating that unless new evidence emerged, there was nothing more they could do. The world moved on, again, but the whispers never stopped. Because deep down, many believed that the killer of Easy Street was still alive, maybe still walking free, maybe watching the news reports about his own crime, and maybe, just maybe, smiling, knowing he had beaten the system for over 40 years. Today, more than 4 decades after that blood-soaked December night, the Easy Street murders remain one of Australia's darkest unsolved mysteries. The small brick house where Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett lost their lives has been renovated, painted over, and occupied by new tenants. But no coat of paint, no new furniture, no laughter from within those walls can erase the echoes of that night. Beneath every nail, every brick, every inch of that ground, there's a story that still breathes, unanswered. For those who remember, the case is more than just a crime. It's a reminder of how evil can hide behind ordinary faces. The police officers who once investigated it have carried the weight of their failure for years. Many still speak about it with heavy hearts, saying it was the one case that never let them rest. The neighbors who lived nearby have long since moved away. Yet some confess they still wake from dreams where they see shadows moving behind those windows, and the faint cry of a child calling for a mother who can't answer. Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett were more than victims. They were daughters, friends, women full of kindness and hope. Their lives were simple, their futures bright, until one act of pure cruelty stole everything. The brutality of their deaths shook Melbourne to its core, but the silence that followed, the unanswered questions, the vanishing leads, that's what truly broke people's faith. It wasn't just about who killed them. It was about how justice could simply disappear. Every few years, someone comes forward claiming to have a new lead, a confession overheard, a DNA link, a forgotten photograph. And each time the families hold their breath, praying for closure. But the answers never come. It's as though the truth itself refuses to be found, hiding in the fog of time. For every theory that rises, another falls. And so the story continues, suspended in the air, unsolved, unending, unforgettable. Even now, standing outside that quiet home, there's an eerie stillness, the kind that chills your bones. The hum of the city fades, the streetlights flicker, and you can almost imagine the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, just as they did that night. The killer's identity remains a shadow, faceless, nameless, perhaps long dead, or perhaps still alive, living among us, unseen. The case of the Easy Street murders reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks beside us in daylight. Sometimes it smiles at us in passing. And sometimes it hides, waiting, watching, in silence. 40 years, 2 women, one mystery that refuses to die. The Easy Street murders aren't just a crime, they're a scar that time could never heal. Maybe the truth is buried deep within those old case files. Maybe it lies within the memories of someone too afraid to speak. Or maybe the killer carried it to his grave. But what do you believe? Was justice ever truly possible? Or did a monster walk free forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this make your heart race, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime mysteries that hide in the shadows of our world. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, evil often wears the face you least expect.